Hello and welcome to Gendering Geopolitics, a special edition series of the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy's Contours podcast. Each episode features conversations with scholars and practitioners from around the world about issues of gender and international affairs. My name is Riley Sullivan, and I am a fellow in the Gender Policy portfolio at New Lines. As technology rapidly advances and artificial intelligence becomes more prominent in both the hands of average people and national decision makers, we must ask ourselves what implications this progress entails. Today, I will be discussing these implications through a gendered security-focused lens with Dr. Lauren Van Metre. She is the president and CEO of Women in International Security, bringing over 2 decades of experience as a leading expert in peace and security. Her distinguished career includes key roles at the U.S. Department of Defense, the State Department, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the National Democratic Institute, where she contributed to major conflict resolution and prevention initiatives. We'll explore the current state of how new technologies have been integrated into security policy and practice, what the costs and benefits of technology we use in conflict are, and how its use incurs disproportionate gendered effects. Finally, we will discuss potential paths forward. So, hi, Lauren. How are you doing today?
Hi, Riley. Let me just start by saying how pleased I am to be here for New Lines Gender and Geopolitics podcast. So thank you for
We are,
having me.
we are so thrilled to have you and all of your knowledge with us today. So I guess to jump right into it, starting off, technology has always shaped warfare, but AI, open source intelligence, cyber systems, and technological military equipment seem to be transforming both kinetic and information operations in unprecedented ways. Um, from your perspective, what makes this moment different? I guess. What is the appeal of integrating this technology into our security practices?
Thanks, Riley. So one of my areas of expertise is Ukraine. And in terms of technology and warfare, I think we'll be using Ukraine for the case study for most of our discussion today. And I think what is interesting about Ukraine is that it's not just the adaptation and advances in new technologies that give us insight into the future of war, but it really is the unique ways that Ukraine is prosecuting the war and how they have integrated those technologies into what I'll call a people's war against Russia's invasion. Although we have a lot to learn from the Ukrainian experience, I think a question we have to ask, and which I hope to answer in this podcast, is whether these technological and military adaptations signify a revolution in warfare or whether they're unique to this particular conflict. So, with your permission, I'd like to dig a bit deeper on some of these ideas.
Yes, please.
Um,
Yeah.
Ukraine's military has been remarkably innovative in using technology to overcome critical deficits in military and in manpower. We hear about Ukraine's recruitment problems. And the most infamous adaptation, sometimes called the drone revolution, dramatically, has been Ukraine's use of UAVs. They use them as sensors and strike platforms. They can conduct long-range reconnaissance missions and assault operations. And they even have ground drones, little robotics that are used for logistics supply and recovering battlefield wounded. Um, I think the most dramatic aspect of drone warfare has, in a sense, been lifting the fog of war. So, in traditional war, you saw units conceal, fire, and maneuver and conceal. But this war is really different in it's about seeing everything. And thanks to copious amounts of data and then using that data to determine priority strikes. And the way they sort of process that enormous data is they use AI. And AI is also now used to assist drone strikes. So they train drones to autonomously identify targets. And this has actually been a newer development as the Russians begin to jam the communications between drone operator and the UAV. So this is I think, one of the first things about the Ukraine war that we have to really understand and be concerned about. We know from Afghanistan the costs of drone warfare, how targets are dehumanized, the potential collateral damage to civilian populations. But AI-assisted drone warfare amplifies these dangers and introduces new ones, such as ultra-rapid decision making and data bias.
Mm-hmm.
But I think really for me, that while analysts are hyped about drones and AI, and I've talked a little bit about why, sort of the lifting of this fog of war, I really think there's another significant aspect of the Ukraine war, and that it's a people's war where civilians are participating in this war and they're using technologies to enable this civilian military cooperation or interface.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and if you don't mind, I'd love to give you a few really good examples of this and talk about the implications of this for just war, for gender sensitivity, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
in most wars, militaries drive technology and battlefield innovation. So when it comes to AI in Ukraine and autonomous warfare and drones, it's actually civilians that have the advanced technologies and are driving the innovation. So the military in Ukraine is the consumer of Palantir, a civilian private sector company, and a consumer of Palantir's technology and expertise. Palantir has a Metre constellation software that monitors the movements of Russian troops, supplies, and planning. And then it uses AI optimization to aggregate all the data from these civilian providers. Another way we see civilians in the lead is that civilian companies also provide satellite imagery to the Ukrainian military. And there are not many militaries actually whose satellites can provide higher resolution than these
Mm-hmm.
civilian systems. And then finally, I think, we saw this in the initial days of the Ukraine war, but it continues even today. We have these enormous civilian intelligence networks. Remember the civilians in Ukraine on phones taking pictures of Russian troop movements and sending them into the Ukrainian government. How they would disrupt Russian disinformation campaigns. So we still see these enormous civilian intelligence networks at work in Ukraine. And
Mm-hmm.
so for me, really, yes, drone warfare and AI assisted, autonomous warfare is a very important facet of the Ukraine war. But it's this aspect of the war, this integrated war and the seamless technology and AI enabled interface between combatants and civilians that introduces real issues, Riley, in terms of the issues that are important to us in women, peace, and security, in terms of
Mm-hmm.
human security, civilian protection, civilian control, and gender sensitivity. So then we then have to ask, I think ourselves, is this type of total warfare or people's war typical of the warfare of the future, or whether it's unique to Russia's war on Ukraine? I think increasingly as methods of hybrid warfare are employed by authoritarian regimes to undermine democracies from within, so the disinformation, the cyber that we're seeing emanating out of Russia into our own countries, and we see civil society and citizens become instrumental in countering these threats. I think we have to accept that if hybrid war becomes armed conflict, like what happened to Ukraine, civilians are already on the front lines of these wars. So we can
Mm-hmm.
expect to see more in other people's wars.
Yeah, all of that was really insightful. I especially agree with the part where you're talking about how it is a people's war and just basic technology has kind of facilitated that in a lot of ways, just phones and how readily accessible information is made because of media and just that general increased accessibility that we now have, which is really interesting to see how it shapes operations, but also just how people view it. Um, Kind of touching a bit on what you were saying about data bias there, it kind of leads into my next question. AI has been a large topic of conversation recently, as we know. It derives its intelligence from pre-existing knowledge from humans, and thus AI replicates existing human biases like gender inequality. I guess my question is, how do these biases influence the impacts of AI use in security operations and the populations they target, surveil, or prioritize?
No, that's a fantastic question. And it's already, right, a central issue in our women, peace, and security field. But again, I think that Ukraine is interesting because of the intertwining of these civilian technologies with military consumption. And it adds a really complex layer, Riley, to the issue of AI and bias. So we already know in our field, we know that information generated by AI is only as good as the data that's used to train the models, right? And we also know that there's a dearth of gender disaggregated data and biases and gaps in the collection of data on women and other marginalized groups. And we also know that there's lots of gender disinformation out there, right? That these AI models can consume and learn from. So we know categorically that AI is gender biased. And we can assume that AI assisted warfare systems will have embedded this gender bias. The problem that we see in Ukraine, I think, is that if these were military controlled systems, we could apply principles of civilian oversight, do no harm, civilian protection. AI models could be trained to be gender or population sensitive. Militaries, in fact, would want that. And civilian oversight could include women's representation in decision making and monitoring. But in the case of AI assisted warfare, as I've said, the civilian companies are in the lead. How do we now think about civilian oversight of the military, human security protections, and gender sensitivity when Palantir, a private company, is gathering the data for the military through its surveillance systems and analyzing it with its AI? So militaries and democracies do have to submit to civilian oversight and often cooperate and coordinate with civil society organizations on issues of civilian protection and human security. We saw that in Iraq and Afghanistan. But how can the principles of just war be applied in these cases where private tech companies are not just involved, they're in control? Their technologies are well advanced in most militaries.
Right. So it's kind of striking that delicate balance of how much civilian oversight can be acceptable slash will be accepted by the military forces. Yeah, that's a very hefty question that I believe is really important to eventually answer, especially as it regards to gendered harms, because of that data. Yeah, wow. Uh, Kind of pivoting a little bit from our previous discussions, um, to technology in the form of cyber in the media. How have you seen these methods leveraged in conflict, and are gendered impacts prominent? If so, how do you see them being an intentional part, or excuse me, do you see them being an intentional part of a conflict party's security strategy, or is it more of a neglected byproduct?
Well, here I'd like to talk a little bit about a good news story, I think, or an avenue
Lovely.
where we could have some influence, I think. And again, I'm going to go back to Ukraine. But I talked about this sort of the people's war and this army of civilians in both hybrid and armed warfare. And one of the really interesting sort of, I think, developments again in Ukraine that's often not as talked about or hyped about as sort of the drone revolution is this idea of open source intelligence, like often called OSINT. OSINT is where you use social media, the internet, satellite images to collect, process, and analyze all this open or public information to produce actionable intelligence. And not only the Ukrainians, but OSINT operations globally, both amateurs, everyday citizens have collected information and sent it to the government of Ukraine. But you also see the emergence of institutions like the Institute of Study of War and Bellingcat that have really promoted sort of these new and very exciting sort of approaches around armed conflict. And so they track Russian military operations. But even more, as we saw in Syria and now in Ukraine, they expose atrocities, they document war crimes. Um, and there are definitely many ethical issues, I think, associated with OSINT. So there is a lack of ethical and legal standards for the field. Not as much on general gender sensitivity and civilian protection. Although I would say that's evolving with these organizations. Um, and then I think another promising way to think of OSINT is that it gets at the issue of AI bias. And if these open source intelligence data is one of the data sets fed through AI, could we train institutions and amateurs to develop standards and protocols that produce gender sensitive or gender disaggregated data to reduce this AI bias?
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, from example, and this is again what I think is really the promising side and sort of the ethical commitment by some of these OSINT operators. Sexual and gender-based violence has been a significant issue in Ukraine, and we see many human rights organizations investigating the sexual and gender-based violence, but they're also incorporating open source intelligence, and there's some super great advantages to this, that OSINT allows evidence collection in really hard to access areas. Like you think of these communities living under occupation in Ukraine's east. Crowdsourced data can supplement NGO reporting. We know ourselves how overwhelmed NGOs get, and that their reporting can often be delayed, and crowdsourcing can help speed this process along, provide greater data. Um, and OSINT can be used and has been used a lot to sort of triangulate survivor testimony. So they, through satellite imagery, through other social media, they can confirm that perpetrators were in the area. So corroborate the testimonies of survivors when they go around seeking justice. And here, like, kudos to Bellingcat, which has developed guidance on recognizing sexual and gender-based violence as a researcher, and the organization has emphasized integrating a gender perspective into its work. So, like I said, here is an example um, of where we could start to see sort of more wide-scale use, civilian organizations incorporating gender sensitivity into their work. We could work with them. If these are organizations that are already committed to monitoring armed conflict, making cases around justice, I think they would be amenable to training in this area. We could insist on standardization, that governments only work with OSINT amateurs and professionals that exhibit high ethical standards, such as gender sensitivity. So it's a really promising area for what you call, Riley, intentionality in terms of a security strategy and incorporating gender sensitivity.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. No, that's definitely interesting to think about in terms of where it all fits in and slash how it will go on to fit into strategy. I think it's just a very it's a time for innovation for security strategy as a whole because of all of these new technologies that are available for use and all their benefits and all of their setbacks. So that kind of leads to the next question. Um, we discussed this briefly with like kind of a future for integrating tech into security strategy, but both policymakers and average people are engaged in strong debates surrounding technology's role in security and daily life alike. In your view, what policy or practice around these technologies do you think is most urgent, especially when it comes to protecting vulnerable populations from gendered harms?
Well, I think really we have a great infrastructure and advocacy network already existing right now. And I think at WISE, where I work, Women in International Security, um, we we see that the world's democracies are militarizing to fight authoritarianism, and that authoritarianism is globally suppressing women's rights, including through technology. And we really think that the Women, Peace, and Security agenda and the amazing global architecture that we have built through WPS really must ensure women's thought leadership on technology and security. And we have to ensure that this militarization that is happening really does not erode democratic norms, institutions, and rights, because then we would undermine the very strategic victory that we hope to achieve, right? Against authoritarianism. So I think that one of the things that WPS needs to start doing is ensure that this securitization actually becomes a vehicle for diffusing norms of accountability, inclusivity, and gender parity, both around security, but around technology as well. Um, so that's the strategic side, is how we can emphasize more the security in the women, peace, and security agenda. But I think there's also some practical things we can do. I've talked around OSINT and how better training, better standards of OSINT can have the benefit um, of mainstreaming gender sensitivity in a really critical intelligence gathering area, but also start to influence AI training models. Um, but I'd also like to talk a little bit about the AI side as well. And so I think on AI practically, so strategic top down and practically bottom up, I think it's really important that our community begins to imagine and advocate for oversight models that ensure human security and gender sensitivity based design are being integrated into these AI assisted autonomous weapons, and that we start to train AI systems in civilian, gender, and combatant behaviors in conflict zones. AI-assisted autonomous warfare is not used in wide-scale applications. So the moment is now to be doing this and influencing this before these technologies become more broadly used. And so I think it's urgent that we be prepared to move on multiple fronts, both the top-down decision-making through the WPS agenda, but also very practical bottom-up practical applications that our community can become expert on and promote women's leadership in.
100%. Like leveraging the existing frameworks that we know already work in the Women, Peace, and Security framework, but also innovating and finding new ways to create best practices. Wow. Yeah, I completely agree with that. And
And meeting
yeah,
this political moment, I think, Riley, is important for me, and wise in all of our community, in the sense that, I think WPS was born of a certain era around civil wars and peace processes. And I think we're just entering a dramatically new sort of geopolitical and strategic moment around securitization and technology advances, and how can we help the WPS agenda adapt to this new strategic reality.
right. Just carving out its place in spite of everything. Yeah,
Yeah.
I completely feel you.
Yeah, everything, the backlash, everything.
Yeah, I have everything. Um, well, it's been fantastic speaking with you. I know I learned a lot, so I hope everybody listening learned as much as I did. Um, thank you so much for your contributions, and I hope that we can continue to learn more from you in all of your future work. We appreciate everything that you do. So yeah, of
Great, Riley. And thanks for the thoughtful questions and the preparation.
course. Thank you so much. Have a good